happened a couple years back when I was 26. My single mother had just passed away, and being the only child, their house was left for me to either sell or move into. I was living in a really nasty apartment because I couldn't afford much back then, and after much deliberation, I decided to move into the house. It was already paid off, so I was saving a considerable amount of money by moving in. My goal was to hopefully save up for a few years and get back on my feet, then sell it and buy the house that I wanted. Once my lease was up at the apartment, I moved across town to the house. It was part of a community of farmland owners, but in the recent years, most of that land had stopped being used for farming and was left as just empty fields. That's what happened with my mom's land as well. It was pretty much just an old barn-style home in the middle of a huge field with only a small overgrown path leading to it. In the first week living there, I spent most of my time cleaning and getting all of my stuff where I wanted it. During one of these nights, while I was cleaning, I heard a car coming toward the house. I looked out the window and saw an old pickup truck driving down the overgrown path. It was very strange, being that the only reason for them driving here would be if they were coming to the house. But just as they approached the end of the path, they slowed to a stop. I could make out a male figure in the driver's seat, but couldn't make out any specifics. They stayed there for a moment, with their headlights shining over the field, before they did a 3-point turn and drove away. I thought they probably just typed in the wrong address or something, but it was kind of creepy to see someone coming all the way out here so late in the night. A few days went by, and by then I'd finished getting the house cleaned up and organized. It was a Sunday night, and I was staying up late watching TV and eating a home-cooked meal, when a familiar sound came up in the distance. A car driving toward the house. I looked out the window again and saw that same pickup truck coming down the path, this time with all its headlights off. Knowing it couldn't possibly be an accident this time, I was more worried. I quickly looked at my phone and saw it was nearly 1 a.m., so why would anyone be coming here? The truck came all the way to the front of the house and parked. Then a man got out and started walking up to the porch. I waited anxiously, but after a minute, there was no doorbell or knocking. I cautiously went up to the front door and looked out the peephole. A man was standing right on the porch, looking directly at the door. I was terrified, as he looked like he was contemplating something. Then he turned around and went back to his truck, getting in and hurrying away. I was really creeped out, so I called the police and reported it, but there was nothing else to be done. I went to bed that night with a really bad feeling about everything. Apparently I was right, because I woke up to what I thought was the sound of a knock at the door. It was just a single knock. I got up right away and looked out the window, but the truck that I thought I'd see wasn't anywhere outside the house. I quietly left my bedroom to try and go downstairs and see who it was, but just as I reached the top of the steps, I could see that the front door was slightly open. I froze, and moments later, I heard footsteps walking through the hallway below me. I quickly hid in the spare bedroom that was next to me and dialed 911 as the footsteps grew louder and started coming up the stairs. They went straight into the main bedroom, and I could hear them moving stuff around like they were looking for something. I was too scared to speak to the officer on the phone, worried the intruder would hear me, so I just sat there silently. They spent a few minutes going through the bedroom before leaving and going back downstairs and finally exiting the house. I started talking to the officer as I ran up to the back window to see if I could identify them before they got away. It was dark, but I could see that it was the same man who was on my porch earlier. He was walking in the backyard toward the field of tall grass, eventually disappearing in it. Police came by and tried to find any evidence to help with the case, but my description of the man was about all there was that was helpful. I don't know what that man wanted, but he seemed to be looking for something specific. It makes me think maybe he knew of something my mother had, and after hearing of her passing, he wanted to steal it. But once I realized he had to have known I was home and probably in the bedroom, it terrified me to think about how he still went in and looked around. What was he planning to do to me if I was still in there? I ended up selling the house a month later because I was too scared of him coming back. Even now, I still check every few months to see if there were any reports of recent break-ins at that address, but it's been quiet ever since that night. Three years ago, I moved down a few states on the East Coast to a new city. Due to work and money, I couldn't make the trip to see the place before making the move, but I was only renting, so there wasn't too much risk in it. It was mid-September when the movers came and loaded everything up, and dropped it off at the house. The landlord was nice enough to let the movers in for me to unload, because I wasn't actually arriving there until the following week. It was a Monday evening when I finally arrived and saw the house in person for the first time. It was a mess, with boxes everywhere and furniture laying all around, but the house itself was alright. The layout was interesting in that it was very separated. It was a single story with the kitchen and living room on one side of the house, then on the other side was a long hallway with all the bedrooms and bathrooms. Since it was already late, I went to the master bedroom and started working on getting the bed put together, then shut off all the lights and went to sleep. I didn't have a clock set up yet, so I don't know what time it was, but in the middle of the night, I woke up to an odd sound. I thought it was a noise the house was making, but I wanted to see what it was, and if it was something I needed to let the landlord know about. I got up and walked over to the bedroom door. As I got closer though, I realized it was coming from somewhere down the hallway. I opened the door, and it stopped almost instantly. The hallway was pitch black, so I flicked on the light, but nothing was there. I slowly walked down and peered into the living room. It looked the same as it had earlier, but I turned on the lights and looked around just to be sure. On the floor, there were a lot of footprints scattered between the boxes that were laying around. I knew it was likely from the movers, and with no other signs of anything, I went back to the bedroom. It took a while for me to fall asleep again, because I kept thinking about how the sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. I tried to come up with any possible way this could be the house making noises, but nothing came to mind. When I drifted back asleep, it felt like I only stayed asleep for a minute before I was woken up by a sudden thump, followed by footsteps running down the hallway. My eyes shot open, and I looked over at my bedroom door. The door was wide open, and on the ground were clear footprints coming right up to my bed. I got up and hurried to see who was there, but by then, they were long gone. All that was left were scuffed prints from them running away. I got my phone and called the police, locking myself in the bathroom until they arrived. When they did, they oddly found no signs of a break-in, aside from the footprints. I convinced myself that they must have gained access during the week before I arrived at the house, but something still didn't sit right with me. After unpacking and checking each box, nothing seemed to be missing. It obviously makes me wonder what they were even doing in the house, but the biggest mystery is why did they walk up to my bed, and what was that thump sound that I heard just before they ran away? The landlord was eager to allow me to break the contract and move out, so long as I didn't say anything about the break-in publicly. At the time, it sounded like he just didn't want anyone to be scared away from the house so that he wouldn't miss out on his rental income, but now I'm not so sure. When I was 21, I made the poor decision to move out of my parents' house before I could afford a place on my own. It was something I'd actually planned out for months, searching for cheap apartments, roommates, and anything that could help me move out. For some reason, I just prioritized moving out on my own over everything else. After months of searching, I found a post on Facebook about a room for rent in my area. It was a 2-bedroom house, and the owner was renting out the 2nd bedroom. I sent him a message on Facebook and got a reply in minutes. He asked a couple of questions, then sent over a document. It looked like a huge list of rules for moving in, all simple stuff that's pretty much common sense. After agreeing to all the rules, he let me come over to look at the room that same day. When I got there, I was very surprised at how clean and well put together the place was. It looked like it was a model house, so perfectly decorated and furnished. The owner, Terry, was a little bit weird though. He was in his late 20s, but his personality and looks didn't match the way the house looked. He was wearing a dirty t-shirt and just had a weird way of talking. Still, I was blinded by the possibility of moving out that I didn't even care. A week later, I packed up a rental van with my stuff and drove it down to the house. When I walked inside, I almost thought I'd walked into the wrong house. It was so empty, no decorations or furniture, except for an old couch in the living room. It was a completely different looking place than the one I'd seen the first time. Terry was standing there and acted like nothing was different, talking my ear off about how excited he was to have a roommate. I asked about all the furniture and everything, but he basically ignored my question and just went straight to moving my stuff into the house. Being a little weirded out, I still moved in. Several weeks went by, and to be honest, I rarely even saw Terry. He was always working and didn't get home until late at night, but about a month in, I started realizing that Terry had stopped coming home most nights. It was maybe once a week I'd hear him get home around 2 or 3 a.m. He'd hang around downstairs for a while, then leave and wouldn't show up for another week or so. Part of me didn't care because I was happy to have the house to myself, but another part of me was curious about what he was up to. I mean, he wanted me to move in so bad, but now he's never here. Then one night at 2 a.m., weeks since I'd last seen Terry, I was woken up to him banging on my bedroom door and yelling my name. I got up and rushed over. Terry was standing in the doorway with sweat dripping from his head and a look of anger. "Do not leave your room," he said in a harsh voice, then grabbed the door and ripped the handle out of my hand, slamming it shut. I stood there in shock, listening to him walk downstairs. I opened the door quietly, and after a few seconds, I heard the sound of him dragging something heavy across the floor and into the garage. I ran downstairs to see what was going on. There was a smear of mud and dirt going across the kitchen and leading up to the garage door. I tried to open it, but he'd somehow locked it from inside. I realized it was best to just remove myself from the situation and ran out to my car, driving away while calling the cops. When they got to the house, Terry was already gone and the smears on the floor had been cleaned up. After some days of investigating, it turned out that Terry was actually renting the house from someone else, so I wasn't even allowed to have legally moved in, and all the documents he sent me and had me sign were fake. Terry likely wasn't his real name either, and as far as I know, he never showed back up after that. I don't know for sure what he was up to, but he was so adamant about me staying in my room that night, and with him vanishing afterward, he clearly had something horrible he was hiding. But what really confuses me is why he wanted me to move into the house and live with him so badly. I can't help but think that he had some sort of plans for me, and I barely got out of there without having to find out the hard way. I lived in the same house for my entire life, all the way from childhood through high school, and even most of college. So when I moved out during my last year of school, it was really weird to be in a different place. I'd rented out an extremely small single-bedroom house on the other side of town, and even though the change of environment was different for me, I still really liked it. On day one, I got a van and moved all my stuff into the new place. I didn't unpack really at all. I just set all the boxes down in the main room and chilled for the rest of the night. The whole process of finding a place, contacting the owners, signing papers, all of it just had me exhausted, and it felt good to be done with all the hard parts of it. I hooked up the TV and stood it up on a few sturdy boxes, then turned on a show to watch. It was probably about 7 o'clock, so it was too early for bed, but as I sat there and watched with half-open eyes, at some point, I began hearing two people talking outside. I lowered the volume on the TV and listened, hearing it sound like they were right outside my house, but they were talking quietly, and whatever they were saying was too hard to make out. I got up and walked over to one of the windows, pulling the curtain back a little, but as soon as I did, a figure quickly moved past it from outside. I jumped back a bit, getting startled by them being so close so suddenly. The voices had stopped speaking by now, but I could hear a set of footsteps quickly going around the house, and then that suddenly stopped too. Just like that, it was completely quiet again. I checked a few more windows before getting back to the couch and continuing with my show. I was sure I was just being paranoid about living alone for the first time in a new environment, and I knew the neighbors' houses were really close, so I assumed it was just them walking around. I sat there for a while and eventually laid down as I started getting sleepy, dozing off around 10. When I woke up, the house was completely dark, with the only light coming from the TV screen. I looked at my phone and saw it was 2 a.m., so I shut off the TV and laid back down. But just as I was about to close my eyes, a soft creak echoed through the floorboards from across the room. I immediately shifted my eyes toward the sound. Standing in the doorway across the hall, a figure was staring at me. His eyes were wide open, peering at me, with half of his body hiding behind the door frame. My eyes were locked on them for the longest few seconds of my life, before they sprinted out of the doorway and down the unlit hallway. Immediately after, another set of footsteps on the other side of the house ran in the same direction. There were a few soft thuds, then silence. The house was still fully dark, making the entire thing even more terrifying. My heart was beating out of my chest, and I was in the odd state of panic while also being frozen in place. When I collected myself, I dialed 911, telling them what happened in between my shaky breaths. While still on the line with the officer, I got up and turned on the light. Through the hallway were scuffed shoe prints going up and down multiple times. Then I turned around and looked back at the living room where I was sleeping, and all over the carpet were more dirty shoe prints, some even getting within just a few feet of where I was sleeping. When cops showed up, they searched around and took a few samples, but they didn't get any hard evidence. Even more unnerving though, they still aren't sure how the intruders got inside or outside the house. I told them about the thuds I heard from the back of the house as they left, but the windows in that area of the house were still locked. I don't know if they had some way of unlocking and locking them from outside, but that had to be it. While the amount of shoe prints showed they likely had been inside for a long time, going through each room multiple times over, nothing ever showed up missing. They never showed any signs of wanting to harm me either, but it all just horrifies me to think about why they broke in. Maybe they were looking for someone else. Whatever the case was, it's been over 2 years now, and they have never come back. This summer in late June, I moved from my apartment into a quaint little home on the outskirts of my city. I was familiar with the area and had been eyeing the house market for a while, hoping to finally leave my apartment and purchase a home. This one was older and needed some work, but the price and location were great. It was a mile down, just off the highway, mostly with trees and grass around, but there were a few neighbors within sight as well. The day I moved in, I drove the U-Haul down to the house, and while I was unloading, I noticed someone watching me. They were standing really far off toward the tree line, but were facing me and just watching as I moved in. Being so far away though, I didn't see much harm in it. I just found it to be kind of creepy. I forgot about them for a while, focusing on getting everything inside the house before dark. I finished around 6, just as the sun was starting to set. With time to spare, I went back outside and locked up the back of the U-Haul, then got in to drive it back and drop it off. When I turned the truck on and started driving though, I noticed that person again, now closer to the road, but still near the trees. When I passed them, I watched as their head turned, following the truck with their gaze as I drove away. During my drive to the U-Haul shop, I got a strange feeling in my gut, just that something was really off about that guy, and maybe he wasn't so innocent. I turned in the truck and ordered an Uber back, keeping my eye out as we drove down the driveway. And although it was probably too dark by now, I'll still note that I didn't see him anywhere. I got out and went inside, turning on the lights and feeling overwhelmed by the amount of boxes and furniture stacked all throughout the house. It was just past 6:30, so I took a dinner break, then got to unpacking. I spent the whole night organizing what needed to go in storage and what needed to be unpacked. Once I had the pile of boxes for storage, I started taking them up to the attic. I pulled the ladder down and carefully climbed up with one hand as I hauled the box up. When I got up there, it was pitch black, but I could barely see the light bulb, reflecting a bit of light from downstairs. I walked over and pulled the string to turn it on, but it was really dim and didn't light up more than a couple feet around. I set the box down and pushed it up against the wall, then went back down the ladder and into the kitchen where I'd piled up my other storage boxes. I picked up another, and as I walked over to the stairs, I heard the sound of metal shaking from the upstairs hallway. It was the clear sound of someone climbing down the ladder. I looked up the staircase, and just a moment later, a man appeared at the top, looking down at me. He started running down the stairs at full speed, and I turned to get out through the front door. I could hear his footsteps coming up behind me as I ran over to my car, getting in and locking the doors as he slammed up against it and tried to open it. After a few failed attempts, he tried to punch the window a couple times, then took off running toward the tree line. I was absolutely terrified, but managed to call the cops. Of course, they didn't find too much, but guessed he might have been staying in the attic for a few days, based on a few blankets that were up there. I don't know the truth, and likely never will, but just thinking about how I was up in the attic as he was hiding somewhere in the dark, just a few feet from me, is terrifying. And he did chase me afterward, so I'm pretty sure he wasn't a harmless person hiding out. But what he would have done to me had he caught me is a question that I don't want answered. In my mid-20s, I had a very odd period of my life where I didn't have anywhere to stay and wasn't making enough money to live somewhere on my own. I was fresh out of college and was running out of time to move out of the dorms. All of my friends from school were just moving back in with their parents or leaving town, so it left me in a bad spot. I needed to find a cheap place and a roommate to split the bills with. As time was getting scarily close to me needing to move, an ad popped up on a renting website. It was posted by a man named Xander, listing the ad as a search for a roommate to move into the house he was renting. I checked the rest of the post, seeing it was a relatively small house, which likely meant it would be cheap too. I replied to the ad, and later that day Xander called me. We set up a tour and agreed on a price, and I ended up moving in. Though basically having to move, I still didn't think it was a bad place. Xander and I got along well. He had also just graduated, so we were both on the same page, and it was actually kind of refreshing to have a friend in a similar position. The house itself, though, wasn't the best. It only had a single bedroom, so my room was the living room. It was better than nothing, though, and I was out working most of the time anyway. After a week or so of living there, having just fully settled in, it was the middle of the night, and I was sleeping in my living room when I heard the front door open. I looked up and saw Xander walking in. He looked over at me, but I don't think he noticed I was awake because he walked right past and down the hall to his room. I heard him move something around, but then he came back out. He walked down to the front door again, this time stopping and turning to face me. Xander stood there and looked at me for a good 5 to 10 seconds before going back outside. Something about the way he was acting made me really uncomfortable. A few minutes went by before I heard some movement outside the front door. When it opened, I closed my eyes so that he wouldn't notice I was awake. He came in and shut the door, then walked slowly down the hallway, breathing heavily. As it got to the end, I opened my eyes slightly, catching a glimpse of Xander holding what looked like a body in his arms. He moved into his room quickly and shut the door. I was almost so in shock that I wondered if what I saw was even real. I came up with every possibility, like maybe he was out partying and the body was just some passed out drunk person needing a place to sleep. I sat up and quietly walked closer to his room to try and hear what he was doing. As I listened to him continually moving around, the worry about what he was up to started to overcome me. After thinking about it, I knocked on his door. All the movement stopped instantly and was followed by multiple seconds of silence before he walked over. I heard the lock click, and then he cracked the door open, only enough for me to see a sliver of his face. He started apologizing for waking me and said he was just rearranging some things. After hearing him lie, I figured I'd just straight up ask, "What were you holding when you just came in? Was that person okay?" His face straightened, and he had a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. He didn't answer. We held eye contact as things got increasingly more intense. Then I quickly slammed my body into the door, knocking Xander back and revealing a lifeless body slouched up in the corner of his room. He shoved me out and locked the door behind me, but I'd already seen enough. I ran back and got my phone, then left the house and called the police. Xander made no attempts to run or hide, but unfortunately, it was too late. The body was completely lifeless and had been so for multiple hours. The details of everything else were withheld, but I know he lied about his age, being almost 30 years old, and I also know he remains in prison to this day. He still has kept to himself about why he did it and what he was doing with the body. I consider myself lucky, though, to have gotten out of that situation quickly, because if I hadn't, who knows where I'd be. When I was 18, me and two of my friends moved in together into an apartment. We all worked regular jobs while doing online school, and with the three of us combined, the rent was easily affordable. Over the following year, though, one of them moved out, leaving just the two of us to pay the bill. It was still affordable, but much less than it used to be, and even had me stressing out a couple times. And after a few months, my other friend moved out as well. It wasn't their fault having to leave, but it still really sucked, and I was forced to find somewhere else to live on just my small paychecks. There weren't a lot of options within my budget, but I was willing to take anything as long as it was a roof over my head. Eventually, I found a listing for an apartment on the other side of town. From the pictures, it looked like a small building, only having 8 rooms, and it definitely was not very nice on the inside. Still, the price was okay with me, so I sent in a request to tour and went there later that night. I met the owner, Jackson, and he walked me through the room. It was really small and really not that great, but again, there wasn't much I could do about it. The following week, I moved in. Once I got used to it, the place wasn't actually too bad. Sure, it wasn't very clean and looked really old, but it had all the basic things I needed. The only thing that felt weird was this one door in the hallway. It was right across from my room, almost looking like it would be just another bedroom. But during the tour, Jackson said my place was actually connected to the neighbors, so we shared that door. He explained that it always stayed locked from both sides, and that I could just ignore it, assuming it was just like a wall. But sometimes I felt like it was a little weird. They could hear everything going on in my apartment. And on the flip side, I always felt like I had to be extra quiet so as to not disturb them. The door was clearly thin, so sound had to be going through easily. However, for the first week or so, I never heard anything from the other side. Like, not even a little bit of noise or anything. It wasn't until one night after working late, I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I heard a really loud thud come from the hallway. I walked over, thinking something might have fallen over in my room, but then I noticed a bit of light moving around under the door to the other apartment. It looked like maybe a phone flashlight or something. I listened for a little bit, not trying to be too creepy, but just wanting to know what was going on. After all, that was the first time I'd ever heard anything from their apartment. But after only a minute, the light turned off and no more sounds came from behind the door. I went back to the couch and stayed up for another hour before going to bed. Throughout the night, I occasionally woke up hearing thuds or soft footsteps coming from that door in the hallway. I never got up to check on it because I knew there was nothing to really check on, but it gave me an eerie feeling for some reason, knowing they were up the entire night doing something in the dark of their room. This went on for a few days, only hearing noises late at night when most people would be sleeping. I never heard anyone talking though, or really anything other than thuds and footsteps. But then one night, something was different. I woke up to a thud far louder than any of the others I'd heard. I immediately sat up in my bed with wide open eyes, staring at my door across the room. Something about that sound sent chills through me, making me feel like this was something I needed to check on. I slowly and quietly got out of my bed and walked over to my door, leaning against it and listening into the hallway. Nothing. It was completely silent now. I carefully opened the door, looking across the hall, and felt my body go numb. The other door was open. I hesitated, unsure what to do, but then I crept into the hallway and looked behind the partially open doorway. I almost didn't believe what I saw. It was a bedroom, slightly smaller than mine, but it was empty, aside from a mattress on the ground. There were no doorways leading to anywhere else. It was just a single room with no way in or out, except for the door in my apartment. I ran and got my phone, dialing 911 as I looked all around my apartment to make sure nobody was there. Luckily, whoever was in there had left. Police came and did their investigation, but strangely, Jackson never picked up his phone, and soon we found out that Jackson probably wasn't who he said he was. We never heard or saw from him again. As for the room, it's honestly just a puzzling situation. It could have been Jackson, or whoever he was, that was living in there and trying to not be noticed. Or it could have been someone else. Maybe they broke out, and that's what the sounds were. To this day, though, I've never gotten any updates on what the true story behind any of it was. Before this next story, I want to share a few words about today's video sponsor, Scentbird. Scentbird offers a monthly subscription service that allows you to explore over 600 designer fragrances. Each month, you receive a 30-day supply of a perfume or cologne of your choice. You can choose from the top iconic brands like Versace, Prada, Gucci, and Bulgari, allowing you to enjoy quality scents without breaking the bank. One of my favorite features Scentbird offers is their discovery quiz. Taking less than a minute and with just a few questions, Scentbird can find the perfect fragrances tailored just for you and your preferences. This month, I received Midnight Gold by English Laundry, Incense Water by Sana Yarden, and Sign by Mercedes-Benz. Each of these fragrances comes with informational cards to see which scents are used, giving you a better understanding of what you enjoy in a fragrance and helping you further discover your favorite scents. For instance, Sign has a woody tone with cardamom and grapefruit accents, while Midnight Gold has bergamot, mandarin, and patchouli, giving it a more earthy and bold scent. The service is only $17 a month, but you can use my coupon code WDiaries for 55% off at Scentbird, bringing it to just a little over $7 for your first month. This is available in both the USA and Canada. Thank you again to Scentbird for sponsoring this video, and make sure to check the links below for an amazing discount. I'm 19 years old, and this happened a year ago. I still live with my parents, and I'm an only child. For my whole life, we lived in the same house in a very average neighborhood. But last year, after I finished high school, my parents chose to move us to a new place. It was a few hours away, in a less city-like town. They talked about it a lot, so it was no surprise or anything. But moving away from where I was used to was very odd for me, especially with the house being so drastically different. It was still technically in a neighborhood, but it had a ton of land, and rather than the houses being right up next to each other, they were each separated by a few acres of forest. Anyway, a couple weeks after moving in, my parents went on their yearly business trip together, flying across the country and leaving me with the house. I was obviously old enough, but it was a bit unsettling to be in the new place alone for the first time. It was summer too, so I didn't have any school or anything. I was just spending all day at the house. The first day went by slowly, as I tried to keep myself entertained by YouTube and Netflix, but ran out of things to watch. On the second day though, I spent a little while sitting outside on the chairs we had set up on the porch, and it wasn't long before I noticed a man by the street. Our driveway was big, so the street wasn't exactly close to our house, but he was standing right next to the entrance of our driveway, kind of in the trees, and looking toward me. I lifted my hand and waved, thinking he was a neighbor, but the man immediately looked away, as if he was trying to pretend like he wasn't looking at me. It was odd, but he walked away afterward. I waited for a few minutes to see if he'd come back, but then went inside. I didn't think on it too much, going about the rest of my day by playing video games and making a frozen meal for dinner. I stayed up later that night. I can't say the exact time, but it was likely close to 1 or 2 a.m. when I finally went upstairs and got in bed. I had trouble falling asleep, same as the night before, so I was laying with my eyes closed for almost an hour. It was just as I felt like I might be able to fall asleep that I heard something downstairs. A few footsteps walking onto the porch outside. I opened my eyes and listened carefully. Before there was a soft click, and then the long creak of the front door opening. I sat there in silence, terrified and to a state of shock where I didn't know what to do. I heard the footsteps enter the house, then walk through the hallway downstairs. They were very slow and quiet, trying to keep their presence unknown. I got out of bed and moved over to the door, locking it, and then going to the corner of my room and hiding behind the bed frame. They continued to walk through the downstairs, barely making any noise. Then there was a long minute of silence before I heard the sound of the staircase creak, and then again, closer to the top of the steps. My heart was beating so fast as I stared at the bedroom door in horror when I saw the shadow move under it and stop right outside. They stood there for an entire minute, probably listening to see if I was in the room. Then they finally walked away, going down the hall and up to the master bedroom. I didn't hear the door open, so I assumed they did the same thing, standing outside the door and listening. Then he started walking back toward my room, but I saw the shadow move past my door, and then the footsteps quietly going down the stairs at a quickened pace. They went straight for the front door, leaving the house, and then it was silent again. I must have stayed in my room, completely still for 30 minutes, thinking it was a trap of some kind, that he was hiding in the house, waiting for me to make a sound. But when I finally got the courage to leave my room and walk downstairs, I saw the front door wide open, and no person anywhere in the house. I called the police and my parents, but as you could assume, they didn't find much. They aren't sure how the person unlocked the front door, but we of course changed the locks and added a chain bolt as well. I also don't know if the person who broke in was the same person I'd seen watching me earlier that day, or if it was someone else. Their intentions are unknown, but my parents think that maybe when they came inside and saw that the master bedroom door was closed, the intruder may have thought that they were home and didn't want to risk going forward with whatever he planned to do while someone else was home. What the person was truly planning will likely never be known for sure. It was the beginning of winter when I had to make a big change of location for work. There was no way around it due to my position, unless I quit, but I really didn't want to do that. Unfortunately though, they were making me move several states over to a place I'd never been to before. It was a small town a decent way outside of the city that just so happened to have a large warehouse that I'd be working at. With no real way to get there beforehand, I had to rent a place without ever seeing it in person. The options were minimal, given the size of the town, so I wasn't very confident in my choice, but I tried to keep my hopes up. When the day came, I left my hometown and drove 2 days to the new place. When I first made it to the town and drove through the roads, I felt very out of place. I was always a city person, and this was the most small-town looking town I'd ever been to. There were very few neighborhoods with newer houses, as most of them were very old 1900s looking homes. The neighborhood my place was in seemed to be a mix of these houses, which looked a bit strange, but at least my house was one of the somewhat newer ones. I parked on the side of the street and walked up the driveway, which had a shipping container in the middle that was delivered with all my stuff in it. I opened up the house key from an envelope and unlocked the front door, stepping inside for the first time. Seeing an empty house is never the best way to judge if it'll be good or not, but this place looked a lot worse than it did in the pictures. There were cracks running along the walls and water stains all over the ceiling, things that must have been photoshopped out of the pictures. The rooms were not very spacious either, but honestly, after seeing all the other houses, this one was probably one of the best in the town. Once I was done looking through the rooms, I went back to my car and got out the air mattress and a couple backpacks full of stuff. It was already really late, and I didn't want to do any big moving until the morning. I decided to set up the air mattress in the living room. I don't know, sleeping in an empty bedroom in an empty house made me uncomfortable, so I just stuck with the living room. I turned off all the lights and laid down. I was really tired, but I still had trouble getting comfortable. About 30 minutes went by of me just laying there and trying to sleep before a knock at the front door startled me up. I looked over at the door, then tapped my phone to check the time. 1 a.m. Nobody should be at the door this late. I got up and quietly went over, looking through the peephole. There were two men, both standing on the porch and looking at the door. It was dark, but neither of them had defining features. I stayed and watched them, not saying anything, and waiting for them to leave. They knocked again, showing no signs of leaving anytime soon. I wondered what they could possibly need at this time of night, and I really couldn't think of anything reasonable. Another 30 seconds passed, until one of them turned around and started to walk away, followed by the other. After they were gone, I sat back on the mattress and tried to figure out why they came here. I spent at least 15 minutes just laying down and thinking, but I guess I was more tired than I thought because I drifted asleep. When I woke up, it must have only been maybe half an hour later. I was still half asleep, but I heard a long, quiet creak come from across the house. I quickly got up and turned on the light. I didn't know if it was just the house creaking or something else, but I was already on edge. I walked down to the room at the other end of the house where I'd heard the sound from, but at first, nothing seemed off. It was just an empty room. That was until I saw a very small gap between the window frame. It was just slightly open. My stomach dropped as I closed and locked it. I had no idea if it was like that before or not. I didn't remember ever checking the windows. My mind was racing though, making me go through the house and check all the windows and doors. But as I went around the upstairs rooms, there was a single scuffed shoe print right in the middle of the hallway. Thankfully, there was no one in the house anymore, but it didn't take away the horror of it. Police came quickly after I called, confirming that it was very likely someone had come in that night through the window. The fact that one or two people had come in through the downstairs window and must have walked through the entire house to get upstairs, all happening while I was sleeping in the middle of an empty room, is a terrifying thought. You just have to wonder what they did when they saw me and what they were planning on doing. And did it have anything to do with the two men I'd seen just half an hour before? I still live in the same house, but I've never had any more strange encounters since that very first night. I'm 26 years old, and this year I settled on a house. I'd been living with my roommates for the past almost 8 years, and seclusion is something I value, so finally buying a home for myself was a huge achievement. It was in a neighboring town about 2 hours out from where I used to live. This town was much smaller in scale and had way less buildings. That's not to say every house was on a farm or anything, but the neighborhoods were definitely not full of close together rows of houses. They were spread out, separated by fields of trees and grass. The home I bought was no exception, being modest and among the less expensive side of the housing market. It was out in a forest a few miles away from the market center in the town. On the day I moved in, I still hadn't met anyone in the area. not the neighbors or the townspeople. And with the house being so far out, with trees blocking the surrounding views, it really felt like I was moving out into the middle of nowhere, completely alone. Saying it like that makes it sound more eerie than it really felt, but it wasn't all that comforting of a thought either. I had a rental van for the day, so I got to work right away unloading my things into the house. To be as quick as possible, I tried to put pretty much everything right in the living room rather than sorting it as I go. This took a few hours, and the sun was coming down just as I was finishing up. I set down a few boxes in the house and started walking out to the driveway for the last couple of boxes, but was caught off guard by a man standing on my porch, almost blocking the whole front door. He startled me, making me jump a bit before showing slight embarrassment and asking what he was here for. The man, looking about 50 or so, smiled and introduced himself as my new neighbor. I said it was nice to meet him and made a short smile, but couldn't really help but think about how I never saw him walking up the driveway to my house. In fact, I had no idea where he came from, given it was just forest around my house. The man stayed there, just kind of looking at me for a second, then turned and walked off my porch. I stood and just soaked in the strangeness of the encounter. After a moment though, I stepped back outside and quickly got the rest of the boxes into the house. I checked out the windows to make sure the man was gone, and I didn't see him anywhere, so after a minute I went out and got in the van, driving it down the long dirt driveway. It had only been a few minutes since the man had left, yet I didn't see him walking as I drove down to the main road. There were no other paths that I was aware of, so this made me a bit more uneasy. Anyway, I returned the van and got a local taxi back home, then started on unpacking. I wasn't working fast because I was already tired and it was late, but I wanted to get some of the furniture put together before calling it a night. I grabbed the pieces to my bed frame and lugged them into my bedroom, beginning to piece it together before a sudden knock interrupted me. I stopped and listened, kind of shaken by it. I got up and quietly walked up to the front door. I kept the door shut and locked, but looked out the peephole and saw the same man from during the day, but this time, something was off about him, more so than before. His body was shaky, with his head moving around in an uncanny way, but his eyes were fixed on the doorknob. He was staring at it intensely, standing close to the door, as if waiting eagerly for me to open it. "Hey, it's your neighbor. Can you open the door?" he yelled, and then knocked again. I still remained on the other side, looking through the peephole. His face began to show frustration and anger, and he banged on the door one more time. He then turned and faced the pitch-black forest, looking out into the darkness. He held his hand up and did some sort of waving motion, followed by him running out into the forest in the direction he waved at. Terrified, I immediately called the police, but it was too late for them to be found and questioned. After that night, though, I never saw the man again. Even to this day, I now have met my neighbors, and of course, none of them were that man, and nobody in town seems to recognize him from my descriptions. I don't know who the man was signaling to in the forest, or even how many people could have been out there, waiting for the man to gain my trust and get me to open the door. What would have happened afterwards, I believe, is best left unthought of. I was driving on the empty highway, fighting to keep my eyes open. It was well past 1 a.m., and I couldn't help but look at the GPS every few seconds, hoping the estimated arrival time would somehow go down faster. I'd been on the road for a dangerous 15 hours straight, only stopping for food and gas on the way to my new home. I'd been forced to move for work, yet funnily enough, it was work that never let me take a trip to see the place I'd be moving to. Finally though, I made it to the highway exit and into the town I'd be living in. It was dark, so it wasn't exactly easy to see what everything looked like, but I could see enough to tell it wasn't as good as where I'd lived before. Most of the buildings looked like locally owned and run shops that were far from what I was used to. Along with that, most of the lights were off. When I got to my neighborhood though, it wasn't all that bad. The houses were pretty regular, sectioned close to each other. I pulled up to my house and parked on the side of the road, then got out to see the place I'd be calling home for the next year. From the outside, it looked like all the others, but what really mattered was the inside. I walked up the driveway and pulled out the key I'd been sent a few days ago, putting it in the lock and turning it, but there was no click. I grabbed the handle and pressed on the door, watching it glide open. It was already unlocked. I quickly went in and looked to make sure that my things were there, as movers had dropped everything off in the morning. After a quick look, nothing seemed to be missing. I knew it was likely that the movers had just forgotten to lock the place up, but it still gave me a bad feeling. On top of all that though, the lights and electricity didn't work. I knew I had to set it up in town, and it was obviously too late at this point to do it tonight, but I didn't think they would just cut the power. I turned my phone light on and started looking through the rooms. The downstairs was okay, pretty standard looking, but with a slightly older sort of feel to it. I made my way up to the second floor. At the top of the stairs was a long hallway with 5 doors. I stepped into each of the rooms one by one, shining my phone light around. They were all very small, and a lot of them had water damage on the ceiling and walls, but when I opened the door to the master bedroom, I was surprised to see a single tarp laying on the floor. It looked dirty, like maybe something the movers had used to wrap furniture with. But what made it so odd was that there was nothing at all upstairs aside from that tarp. All the furniture and boxes were downstairs. I took a step back and closed the door. I was already so tired, I just wanted this night to be over with. I really didn't want to crowd my mind with the uncertainties of moving here. I went back downstairs and sat on one of the sofa chairs that was still wrapped up in plastic and rested my eyes. My eyes jolted open as a sudden thud echoed throughout the house from above me. Honestly, I don't even know if I'd fallen asleep or not. All I remember was sitting down and closing my eyes. The sound was harsh though, not just some small thump. I stood up and went to the bottom of the stairs, looking up at the dark hallway. The house was now silent. I must have stood there for a whole minute before taking my phone out and turning on the flashlight, then slowly walking up the creaky stairs. When I got to the top of the steps and shined the light down the hallway, I immediately saw the door at the far end was slightly open, and the unmistakable outline of a figure was standing between the crack in the doorway, looking right at me. I almost fell backwards down the steps as my immediate reaction was to turn and run. I sprinted for the front door and straight out into the driveway and into my car. I thought about driving away, but knowing literally all of my things were inside that house, I wanted to make sure whoever was in there didn't make it out with anything. I called 911 and waited for their arrival on the side of the road. During the whole 5 minutes, I never saw any movement in the windows or anyone leave through the front. When the police searched the house though, the back door was wide open. It was obvious to them that whoever that was had been living inside the house, probably since it had been vacant over the past couple months. At first I thought they were talking about the attic, since I'd looked through all the rooms and saw nothing but a tarp, but there was no attic. They were talking about the master bedroom, which meant that when I was looking around upstairs that night and I opened the door to that room, it's likely that the person was hiding along the wall, probably right behind the door. And if I had gone further inside the room to investigate the tarp and look around, there's a chance that I wouldn't have made it out. This happened to me 3 years ago when I'd moved into a small home. It was only a mile from where I was living before, so it wasn't a very unfamiliar place at all. However, it was on the side of town that I didn't really go too often, due to it having a record of crimes and just overall a bad reputation. At the time, I wasn't in a good financial place, so I had to go with the cheaper places, which happened to be in that area. The day I moved in, I didn't talk or really even see anyone. I just moved my stuff from the U-Haul into my new place. On the second day, I started the unpacking process by moving the boxes and furniture into the rooms that they belonged in. Once I got to moving my office furniture though, I saw something out the window that caught my attention. There was a man, young, like 25 years old, standing in my driveway. I watched as he just looked at the house, walked into the yard, looking into my windows from afar. Getting uncomfortable, I left the window and went downstairs to confront him, but when I opened the door and looked outside, he was already gone. Not in my yard or driveway, or even on any of the sidewalks. He'd just completely left. I waited to see if he'd come back, but then shrugged it off and got back to what I was doing. Yeah, it was weird, but I didn't know what exactly I was supposed to do about it. I got my office set up, then went out to get some lunch before getting back to work on the bedroom. By 8 p.m., I was pretty tired. I kept on with it for as long as I could, but once 10 o'clock rolled around, I was just done for the night. The house was still a mess, but I left it as is, turning off all the lights and getting in bed. It only took a few minutes for me to fall asleep. When I woke up, I rolled my head over and looked at the clock I had laying on the floor. 3 a.m. I rolled back over and closed my eyes, but a muffled sound woke me right back up. I lifted my head and listened again, hearing a faint sound from downstairs. It was like something being dragged across the floor. Still in disbelief, I sat up and listened even more intently. A few seconds later, a similar sound came again. I stood from my bed and walked over to the bedroom door, opening it and looking down the hallway as I listened. But as soon as I opened the door, all the sounds stopped. I walked into the hall and over to the staircase. I went down a few steps and looked over the railing, but I didn't see anything, and the house was still completely quiet. When I got to the last step, I flicked on the light. At first, everything looked okay, nothing missing and nobody in the house. But then I noticed something really strange. All of the furniture and boxes that were against the walls had been pushed away, and behind them, there were several carved out portions in the wall. I felt blood rush from my face as I realized that someone had to have broken into my house and may even still be inside. I ran up to my room and called for help, but the house remained quiet the whole time I waited. What's more unsettling is that the cops couldn't figure out how the intruder got inside or back outside, nor did they figure out why the person broke in. The only idea is that it looks like they were looking for something in the walls. I don't know what, but there was nothing else to go off of. I think back to that man I saw standing outside my house, wondering if he was the one to have broken in. But even 3 years later, nothing else is known about what happened that night. Me and my best friend, who I'll call Alex for privacy, decided to rent a house together. We talked about being roommates for a while because neither of us wanted to live with our parents anymore. We were attending community college and had jobs, so it felt like moving out was just the next step. We found this really small, but still somewhat nice home that was only a 10-minute drive to school. This was last year, when COVID was still big, so we were able to schedule a self-tour and look at it ourselves. We both thought it was that perfect, kinda crappy yet cheap house for us to spend our college years in. It even had a decent yard and wasn't crammed together with neighbors all around. One thing that caught our attention though was this creepy old shed in the backyard. I mean, it just looked like a regular shed, I guess, but it had a padlock on it. In the description of the house online, it didn't mention it anywhere. Neither of us cared to use it anyway, so we ignored it and signed the lease. I was super pumped, and I could tell Alex was too. A month later, we moved in. The first week was great. This was both of our first times living on our own, so the freedom of it was amazing. On a normal Saturday night, I was in the living room watching TV, waiting for Alex to come home from work. It was only 7, and Alex got off at 8. Through the TV playing, I heard what I could have sworn was a large door shutting. It came from outside, and my first thought was the shed. There was absolutely no way I was going out there to check by myself. When Alex got back, I told him what I heard. He asked me over and over if I was sure it wasn't from the TV or something, but I knew it wasn't. Alright, let's take a look then. We turned our phone flashlights on and went outside. We were maybe 20 feet away from the front of the shed, and everything looked exactly how it was before. The lock was still on the front, so there was no way someone could have gone inside and locked it from the outside. Alex gave me a look like I was crazy. We went back inside and watched TV for a while. I couldn't stop thinking about what I heard though. I was starting to question whether or not the sound was even real. At one point, while watching TV, I looked to my side and a figure was standing outside the window staring at us. Alex didn't see him, but he heard his footsteps running away, so we were on the same page this time. Alex asked what we should do, and I didn't know. We'd never had to deal with something like this before. I wasn't sure if that guy had something to do with the sound I heard earlier either. We kept our eyes and ears open for a couple hours, and with no further strange sightings, we went to bed. It took a bit for me to fall asleep, but I think I finally dozed off around 10 p.m. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange, bright red glow flickering across the walls of my room. It was coming through the slits in my window. As I became more awake, I realized I was hearing something too. A soft crackling sound, also coming from outside. I was still tired, and my head wasn't fully awake, but then I heard Alex call my name from the hallway outside my room. "Hey, wake up!" As I was about to ask what was going on, I was interrupted by something eerie, horrifying, and loud. I turned my head to the window, pushing aside the covers. The shed was in flames and had just fallen over. The huge fire was getting close to the house. Alex called 911, and we both took his car and drove across the street. The fire department was able to get the fire extinguished before it got too serious. Only minor burn damage was done to the side of the house. We told the police about what we'd heard and the man I saw, thinking maybe he had done this, but there was nothing to go off of. Everything that was inside the shed was ashes, except a few old metal tools. It makes me think that someone was doing something in there and probably burned it down to hide evidence of their doings as soon as we moved in. It all just seems like too much of a coincidence. I don't think we'll ever know what exactly happened that night though, or what was going on inside that shed. My lease agreement was coming to an end, and the owners of the home decided they wanted to sell the house after this lease, so I was forced to find a new place instead of renewing the lease like I'd planned on. It's unfortunate because they only gave me a month's notice, which is not a lot of time to find a new house. I worked full-time, which only made things harder. The first 2 weeks flew by, and I only had the next 2 weeks to find a house, pack, and move in. I was stressed out of my mind. With time running out, I just applied to 3 houses nearby without even touring them. 2 of them declined me, but I got accepted by the 3rd. From the pictures, it didn't look nearly as nice as the house I was staying at, but I did the best I could with the shitty situation I was given. I rented a U-Haul and got my stuff over as soon as possible. After getting all the boxes inside and all the furniture where it needed to be, I finally had a chance to look at the house. It was a lot worse than the pictures had shown. The walls had paint peeling, and everything just looked aged and outdated. The rent was cheap, but not enough to make up for the trashy condition of the place. I was too tired to take care of anything right away though, so I got my bed ready and crashed for a quick nap. I slept a lot longer than I wanted to, and woke up well rested around 9 p.m. I checked my phone and saw I had a text from the landlord. He just greeted me and told me to call him if I needed anything. It was already pretty late though, so my angry call was gonna have to wait until tomorrow. I closed my phone and went downstairs to make myself something to eat. Right when I turned the corner into the kitchen, I jumped back. A man was standing in the middle of the living room, looking right at me.
What the f***?
I said under my breath, not sure what to do yet. It was really dark and I couldn't read his face. He was just kind of blank.
What are you doing here?
I said. The man turned around and walked out the front door in no hurry at all. My first instinct was to run up and lock the door. Then I called the landlord, but he didn't pick up. I looked out the windows to see if he was still around, but he seemed to have left for good. Calling the police crossed my mind, but I was just so confused by the whole interaction, I didn't even feel threatened really. I didn't see anyone outside for a while, so I left the windows and sat on the couch. I didn't have my TV set up yet, so I had nothing better to do than start packing. I went through 4 boxes and was working on the 5th when someone knocked on the door. I walked over cautiously and turned on the porch light, then called out, asking who was there. There was a long wait before they answered.
It's me, your landlord.
I opened the door a bit and looked at him. He looked really similar to the man I'd just seen in my house, but I wasn't sure.
Hey, did you need something? I'm just here to make sure you settled in nicely.
He said with a big smile, leaning his hand on the door.
Yeah, I was just about to go to bed. I'll talk to you tomorrow,
I said, pushing the door, but the man outside kept his hand on the door, not letting me close it. I stopped pushing for a moment, and the man smiled again. Then it all hit me at once. the fear and creepiness of the situation. I slammed my body into the door, closing it too quickly for him to react, then turned the bolt lock. I heard the door handle turn, and the man outside bash against it. There was another long wait before the man sprinted away from the porch. I called the police, then got my car keys and put them in my pocket to prepare for a quick escape if I needed to. I waited for a couple minutes, still just standing by the front door, before I heard leaves crunching around the house. They went to the back door and stopped. I walked up a bit and peered around the corner, and right in front of the back door was that same man, standing outside with a hammer in his hand. I took this chance to run for my car. I opened the front door and ran to my car in the driveway. I got in and locked the doors, then backed out. I saw the man on the side of my house watching me as I drove away. The man was gone when the police got there. They did a whole investigation, and during it, I met the landlord in person. He was not the man I saw at my door, but he did look oddly similar. He even talked in a very similar way. It made me wonder if he had a brother or something. I don't know. It could also be a creepy neighbor or a homeless person. Either way, I never encountered the man again, but once my lease was up, I moved out and never looked back. This was my first time ever purchasing a house. I was 28 and looking for a place to settle down. I began my search for a house 5 months before my lease ended at my current residence. This one place that I found was perfect, but it was pretty far over my budget, so I had to pass on it and keep searching. I viewed a ton of other places, and even thought I'd found a good home, until that same house came up on my search again. The price had been lowered tremendously, putting it in the mid-range of my budget. I scheduled a tour, and eventually bought the home. Obviously, I was ecstatic. It felt like a really big move forward in my life. It was a 2-story home with a basement and large yard with trees all around. The only slight issue was that it was 20 minutes away from most stores and shops, but I worked from home, so I didn't need to go out all that much. Within the first few days, though, things got a little strange. While working from the living room one day, I heard some sounds coming from the basement. Things moving around or dragging on the floor. I got up and opened the door to the basement, but the sound stopped. It was silent. I turned on the light and walked a few steps down, but nothing was there. I had only a couple boxes in the basement, so it was entirely empty aside from the water heater and air conditioner in the far corner. I'd only been in the place for a couple days, so I thought I just wasn't used to the sounds the house made. After all, there wasn't anything in the basement. But only a day later, I heard it again. This time, it was more of a soft wooden sounding thud. Maybe a piece of wood hitting the wall. I went down the basement stairs all the way this time and did a perimeter check around the walls, but again, the basement was empty, so there was nothing to even check. Still, I blew it off. What could it possibly even be? I didn't believe in anything paranormal, so logically, it had to be the house. During the first week of staying in my new house, I had experienced these sounds probably 6 or 7 times. By the 4th or 5th time, I stopped even checking and started ignoring it. That was until I explored the outside of my house. I was just walking around, enjoying the nature scene, when I noticed one of the tops of the basement window wells was missing from the side of my house. It in itself wasn't an alarming find, but just something I needed to fix right away before it rained and flooded my basement. I went out and got a cover from a hardware store and installed it that day. That night, I went to bed early, but woke up at 11 p.m. to another wooden thud sound from the basement directly below me. A second later, I heard something else. This time, it was very distinctly footsteps going from one side of the basement to the other. I was horrified. Part of me was absolutely positive there was someone in my basement, but there was another part of me that thought it could be something I was imagining, or even somehow another noise from the house. I needed to know for sure though. I took my bat that I kept in my room and walked downstairs and over to the basement door. Just before I approached it though, an extremely loud thud came from outside the house. I stopped in my tracks, waiting for anything else. Then I opened the basement door and walked down slowly. Nothing was there, just the same empty basement. I looked all around and even waited for a few minutes for more sounds, but it was just like every other time when I went to investigate. As soon as I'd open the basement door and look around, it would be silent. I got really uneasy after a few minutes and went back upstairs. I put a chair in front of the basement door so that if there was somehow someone down there, I'd at least have a heads up if they tried to open the door. The next morning I checked the basement again, but something felt different. It was much brighter than usual. I checked the window well and could see from the bottom that the top cover was gone again. I went outside and looked around everywhere for it, but it was completely gone. That was enough for me to call the police though. Something was going on. They sent one officer who took notes from me and searched around the basement. He found just as little as I did. I got a new cover for the well and hired a handyman to come out and install bars on the window from the inside. After that, I never experienced any more sounds or noises. I don't know what exactly I was dealing with in my basement. Maybe someone squatting there, or maybe something else. Even now though, 3 years later, I still have that fear in the back of my mind of hearing those sounds again. I lived with my older brother for about 4 years after I finished school. We shared rent on an apartment together since neither of us could afford anything on our own. But during the 4th year, my brother started making better money and he planned to move out once the lease came to an end. I wasn't making a lot, so I knew I couldn't afford to pay for the apartment alone. I looked around online for a roommate for a few months, but decided to just move out as well and find a cheaper place. I searched up until the last month of our lease at the apartment. My brother had basically moved everything out already, and there was a lot of pressure on me to find somewhere quick, but with my extremely low budget, it wasn't easy. Eventually though, I stumbled across a listing posted by a homeowner renting out a room in their house. The man's name was Evan. I sent him a text to let him know I was interested, then kept searching. A few minutes later, he responded. We scheduled a time to call later in the day, and when we did, he explained all the details. He said he lived alone in the house and was renting out his spare bedroom, but I'd be able to use all the other rooms in the house too. It sounded great to me, so I agreed to it, and a couple weeks later, I tossed everything in a U-Haul and drove down to the house. Between this time, we'd been texting and calling, and he sent me a bunch of pictures of the house, but I hadn't had the chance to view it in person yet. I got there around noon, parking in the driveway. The house was definitely small, but it looked nice from the outside. Evan was standing in the garage, waving me over. He gave me a quick tour, then helped me unload all of my stuff into my room. Evan seemed like a regular man in his mid-30s, which was almost 10 years older than me, but I didn't really mind. He didn't hold conversations very well though, and was somewhat shy. Anyway, we finished moving everything inside, and I dropped the U-Haul off. I Ubered back to the house, and by then it was almost 8 p.m., and I was really tired. Evan was on the couch watching TV, so I told him I was going to bed early, and I went to my room. All in all, it seemed like a decent place, and I was happy with it. I unpacked some more, then set up my bed, and by 9 o'clock, I was finally ready to sleep. I walked over to my door to lock it and turn off the lights, but as I reached my hand out, I saw the knob on the door was empty, as in, there was no lock on it. Confused, I opened the door. The lock was on the outside of the door. I stepped into the living room and asked Evan why the bedroom door locked from the outside. He looked confused and said he never noticed that, but he would switch it around tomorrow. I shrugged and said okay, then went back to my room. I was tired and not too worried about it, but it was definitely an odd find. I got in bed and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I heard someone moving around in the kitchen, which I assumed was just Evan getting water or something, so I closed my eyes again. A minute later, I heard him walking back down the hallway, but as he was passing my room, he stopped. I opened my eyes and looked at the door. He was standing out there quietly for maybe 15 seconds before I heard a click. He locked my door. My stomach dropped and I felt my face go cold as Evan walked down to his room. As soon as I heard his bedroom door shut, I got up quietly and went over to the door. I tried the handle and it wouldn't budge. I stood in shock for a few seconds, coming to reality that this man I just met has now locked me in a room. My fear started to turn into anger. I called out for Evan, telling him to open the door. It only took a second before I heard Evan run out of his room and over to my door. I heard him place his hand on the door, but he paused for a few seconds before he unlocked it. I swung the door open right away.
What the fuck was that?
I confronted him. Evan was stumbling words out, saying he just wanted to make sure he was safe because he didn't know me. I understood that concern, but locking someone in a room was not a smart way to go about it. I told him that I was going to pack up and leave in the morning, and I stayed up all night on the couch in the living room, waiting for the U-Haul store to open. At 9 o'clock, I looked into the hallway, seeing Evan's bedroom door was still closed, hopefully meaning he was still asleep. Then I drove straight there and drove the U-Haul back to the house. When I went inside though, Evan's bedroom door was open.
Evan?
I called out. I walked over to his room and peeked my head inside. His room was empty. I moved my eyes around the room in disbelief. Seeing as things were only getting weirder, I backed out and got straight to moving my stuff. I powered through 2 hours of moving boxes and taking apart my bed. I only had 2 boxes left. I ran inside and picked up another, then rushed to the front door until Evan appeared in the doorway.
Move,
I said. He stared at me, emotionless. After a few seconds, he stepped aside. I hurried past him and shoved the box in the U-Haul. The last box was half full of random food I kept from my old pantry at the apartment. I decided to just leave it. Evan was freaking me out, and I wanted to get away from him as soon as possible. I started closing the back of the U-Haul before Evan interrupted.
you forgot this.
He held out the last box.
Oh, yeah, thanks.
I grabbed it from him and climbed back in the truck. I felt him watching me as I stacked the box, and when I turned, he had his hand on the door. He started pulling it down, trying to close me in. I was able to stop him before the door was even halfway down. I shoved him on the ground, but he got up and ran, not in the house, but off into the trees away from the house. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't care. I quickly shut the back door and drove away. My brother was nice enough to let me stay with him until I found a new place. I don't know what happened at that house, or what would have happened, but there was definitely something very wrong going on. I moved into my new house last year during winter. It was a beautiful, spacious home with a big backyard. It was my first house ever buying. Moving was a bit of a hassle though, because I was alone, so I had to move everything by myself. I pulled up with the truck early in the morning and shoveled all the snow off the driveway, then started bringing all of the boxes and furniture inside. I finished pretty late, around dinner time. I went back outside and locked up the truck, planning to drop it off the following morning. I don't remember doing much for the rest of the night. I probably just watched something on my phone, but I didn't have my bed set up yet, so I slept on the couch downstairs. It wasn't the most comfortable couch, but as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a strange noise coming from outside. It sounded like someone was walking up to my porch. I sat up and listened carefully, looking at the front door. The sound stopped just before they reached the door though. I waited for a while until I thought I was just hearing things and ended up falling asleep. In the morning, I woke up to find that the front door was unlocked. I was certain I'd locked it before bed. I checked for any signs of someone walking around outside, but there wasn't anything. I dropped off the truck, then spent the whole day unpacking and setting up the rest of the furniture. I had mostly everything done by the end of the day. At 6, I went out for a quick dinner and got home around 7. As I pulled into my driveway though, I saw something strange in the snow outside my house. I parked and got out. There were footsteps in the snow leading right up to my front door. I looked all around and tried to follow the footprints from where they came, but they ended by the sidewalk, which had already been shoveled. It could have just been a neighbor wanting to say hi, and that's the excuse I told myself to put me at ease. I finished the last of the unpacking, and before bed, I checked all the doors and windows. I walked up to the front door and immediately noticed it was unlocked again. I got my key and tried it, making sure it worked and couldn't be unlocked without it, but sure enough, everything seemed to work just as it was supposed to. I was confident I had locked the door and kept it locked all day. I just didn't understand why this was happening though. Nothing was missing from the house, and there were no signs of an intruder. I mean, it was cold, wet, and snowy outside. If someone had come inside, they would have left watery shoe prints everywhere. I made sure the door was locked, then went up to my bedroom to shower before bed. As I was getting out of the shower though, I heard something downstairs. It was soft and hard to distinguish. Usually, I would assume it was nothing, but with everything going on, I had to check. I got dressed and walked down the stairs slowly. I turned the corner around the stairs, and right in the hallway was a man. He was facing me, standing still, with the front door opened behind him. I was in some sort of shock, frozen in place. After a moment, I sprinted back up the stairs and locked myself in my room. I didn't hear him following me, but I was still terrified. Then I heard footsteps walking through the rooms downstairs. I took this chance to call the police, as the man downstairs continued walking around. After maybe 2 minutes, I heard the front door slam shut and the footsteps leaving the property. The police found nothing of use and suggested putting up security cameras and changing the locks on the door. I did both, but the man never came back. I almost wish he did, so that I could catch him on the cameras, because now I feel like every day I'm just waiting in fear for him to come back. I'm not sure what he was doing or wanted to do, but I hope I never have to know. I moved across the state to a newly built house. My previous landlord decided he wanted to sell his house, so when our lease agreement was up, he kicked me out. I decided to also lease this new house, but I was honestly really excited for this place. As soon as I moved in though, I noticed my neighbor across the street staring at me several times within the first couple days. He was a middle-aged man, but didn't seem to ever be away from his house. I tried to brush it off, assuming that maybe he was just curious about the new person in the neighborhood. But the more I saw him, the more I realized there was something off about him. He never spoke to anyone, he never smiled, and he never left. He just stayed in his house, watching. I would catch glimpses of him through my window and see him standing in his driveway at odd hours of the night. It was starting to freak me out. One night, as I was settling in for bed, I heard a noise outside. It was a scraping sound, like someone dragging a heavy object across the ground. I peeked out the window, and there was my neighbor, dragging what looked like a large ladder across his lawn. It was really late. I had no idea why he would be needing to do any work on his house at this time. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid because I was in a new place surrounded by new people, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about my neighbor. I tried to calm myself and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I saw him outside again. This time, he was standing at the end of my driveway, staring at me through my window. I pulled the curtain shut and I tried to ignore him, but the feeling of him watching me gave me chills. I didn't like that he was by my driveway either, so I quickly got into my car and pulled out of the garage. He was back in his yard by then, but he watched me as I drove away. Things grew a lot worse from here. One night, as I laid in bed, I could clearly hear someone walking in the grass in my backyard, which was fenced in. I got up and looked out the window, but the footsteps stopped. I waited in my bed for probably 30 minutes, but I didn't hear any more footsteps. I got up and checked the window one more time to be safe, and far back in the yard was a figure. It was hard to make them out because it was so dark, but there was definitely someone standing there, watching me. I backed away and called the police, but the man had left before they arrived. I told them all about my creepy neighbor, but they told me there was no evidence of any wrongdoing and that my neighbor had never been in trouble with the law. I was basically on my own unless something more serious actually happened. I started to take precautions, locking my doors and windows and avoiding being outside as much as possible. Even then, I didn't feel much safer. I'd been at the new house for almost 2 weeks at this point, and even thought about breaking my lease agreement. Then something happened. I got home from work late, and pretty much went straight to bed, but in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of something thud against the side of the house. It sounded like it was right up against the wall outside my bedroom though, which was on the second-story floor of my house. I slowly got out of bed, heart racing in my chest, and pulled the curtains back from my window. I jumped back and screamed, seeing my neighbor's face staring at me from just inches away from my window. He was standing on a ladder, trying to look into my bedroom. He quickly climbed down and ran away. I called the police again, and just a few minutes later, they caught him trying to get the ladder down. While he didn't admit to what he was doing, It was very obvious. In the following days, one of my neighbors came by and explained that they had some weird encounters with that neighbor guy as well. They said they saw him looking through their windows as they were coming home from work one day. Part of me wonders if they could have prevented this whole thing from happening to me if they had just reported the guy. But either way, it's over now. As a fairly young adult, I had just purchased my first home. It was a small house on the outside of town, and I hoped to do some renovations over the years and then sell it for a profit. I was also just excited to have my own space for once. The previous owner had left the house completely empty, with no furniture or personal belongings left behind. I was moving from a one-bedroom apartment, so I had barely enough things to even fill a single room. I was able to complete the whole move in half a day though. In the end, the house still looked really empty, which I knew it would, but it was kind of weird to live in a somewhat empty house. The first night was good, but I had some trouble sleeping due to some noises the house was making. It was a pretty old place, being nearly 70 years old. It had a few renovations done, but the frame was probably just creaky and weak. That morning, I stayed in the house all day, unboxing everything and setting a few things up, like the TV and all of my kitchen appliances. By 8 p.m., I felt the relief of doing everything I needed to do for the day, and I sat back and turned on a movie. A few minutes into the movie, a large thump vibrated the ceiling, like something heavy had dropped on the floor above me. It caught me off guard, making me flinch. I had no idea of anything heavy that could have fallen. I went upstairs and took a look around, but the few things I had in the rooms were just as they had been when I set them up. It was such a loud sound though. I mean, I even felt it vibrate the house, so I knew it happened, but I had no idea what it came from. I double-checked everywhere on the second floor, and even the first floor, but I came up short again. I went back to the movie, but the sound still lingered in my mind, and even made me wonder if there was some sort of major problem with the house that I didn't know about. Once the movie was over, I shut everything off and dragged myself to bed. When I woke up, though, I was confused. It was the middle of the night, and there was a rhythmic creaking noise coming from the hallway. I got up and went to my bedroom door, still hearing the creaking. Right when I opened the door, my heart stopped. The attic door was hanging down, swinging back and forth as if it had just been opened, and there was a ladder coming down from it. I ran past it, going downstairs to call 911, but not even halfway down the steps, I hear someone start running across the floor. I froze in place as they opened the back door and ran away. I quickly went down and locked it behind them, then called 911. While I waited for the cops to show up, I checked the rest of the house just to be safe. I climbed the old ladder up to the attic, seeing a surprising amount of things. Furniture, boxes, trash, all looking really old. When the cops got there, they said it was most likely someone living in my house while it was vacant. They assured me that they were probably gone for good, but to just make sure everything stays locked up for a while. Whoever was living in my house hasn't come back, but there's always this terrifying feeling I get every time I come home from work. like someone could be hiding in my house right now without me even knowing. Before we get into this next story, I want to take a moment to talk about the sponsor for today's video. Aura is an all-in-one digital security service providing continuous monitoring of your personal data, along with quick resolutions to help you resolve any potential threats. Along with this, Aura's apps can encrypt your Wi-Fi connection to aid in keeping your home devices secure. Personal identity and data theft is unfortunately very common now, having affected nearly 1/3 of all US citizens and continuing to affect 15 million US citizens every single year, costing billions of dollars. With Aura, you can be assured you have the greatest security and prevention. While this can all sound complicated to set up, it's actually extremely simple. I signed up for myself in less than 5 minutes, and after signing up, I was able to have Aura scan and remove my personal data from all over the internet, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers, by just clicking a few buttons. These companies make a profit off of your private information, so removing your personal data is extremely important. After this, Aura set up continuous monitoring on all of my data, ensuring any issues can be resolved rapidly by notifying me the instant something comes up. I am genuinely impressed with this service, and the peace of mind it brings me is above everything else. By using aura.com/whisper or scanning the QR code, you can get a completely free 14-day trial, allowing you to see if your personal data has been leaked, remove your data from multiple large platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I strongly suggest everyone to try it out and keep your identity secure. This happened to me a couple years ago, after I just rented and moved into a new house. The first week went by quick, with no issues at all. I unpacked, bought some new furniture, and got everything set up the way I wanted. The main reason I moved there was because I got a work from home job, so having a quiet place to work was important. This house was far from others and gave me a peaceful work environment. One morning, after making breakfast and sitting down to work, I got a knock at the front door. I walked over and answered it. It was my landlord. He was smiling and asked me how I was doing.
Yeah, I'm doing good, thank you.
I said, still unsure why he was here. He tried to make small talk for a minute before saying he was just checking in on me, and then he left. I went back to work, but that was definitely weird. I didn't mind him being friendly, but he could have just texted me instead of randomly dropping by the house. The rest of the day went by, and I'd forgotten about it. After dinner, I went for a walk around my street. My neighbors' houses were well spread out, so I never actually got a chance to see the other houses in the neighborhood. I walked for maybe half an hour, then turned back. As I rounded the corner toward my house, I saw a car parked on the side of the street. It wasn't directly in front of my house, but there weren't any other houses nearby. When I walked up and passed it, I realized it was the same car my landlord had in the driveway when he was showing me the house, but there was nobody in the car. I hurried up the driveway and went inside. I looked out the window, trying to see if he was in the yard or something, but I didn't see him. I wasn't scared really, but just uncomfortable and weirded out by the situation. I had just walked around the whole neighborhood, so I didn't know where else he could even be other than the house. After a while, I stopped looking because I wasn't seeing anything. Another hour or so went by until a knock came from the front door. Looking out the peephole, I saw it was my landlord again. I sighed in annoyance and opened the door. He was smiling again, asking how I was doing.
Yeah, I'm still good, thanks. Can you just make sure to let me know when you plan on dropping by next time, though?
I said politely, trying not to be rude. He apologized and said he just wanted to make sure I was happy with the place. I smiled and said I had to get back to work, then shut the door. Something about that interaction, the way he talked and the way he looked at me, was just really creepy. Obviously the guy didn't understand social cues, but I don't know, he just rubbed me the wrong way. I went to bed that night, thinking of the best way to tell him I want to be left alone. He was my landlord, and this was technically his house, but there are rules they have to follow when renting it out. I fell asleep, still unsure of what to do, but I was woken up not long after. It was well past midnight when a knock at my door forced me up. I turned on the lights and went downstairs, the whole time thinking that if it was the landlord again, I would be furious. I checked out the peephole, and sure enough, it was him again. I swung open the door.
What are you doing here? You can't be here right now. You need to leave.
I said strictly, barely holding back my anger. That's when I saw he was holding a duffel bag. He explained that there was an immediate repair he needed to do on the pipes in the basement. He said he had an alarm hooked up on his phone that went off saying there was a minor gas leak. None of the alarms actually went off in the house though, so this was really suspicious. I told him I'd just call someone in the morning and went to close the door when he suddenly forced his body inside, pretending to not notice I was closing the door. I just stood there now, not knowing what to say or do. He looked at me, fully in my house, and smiled.
It'll only take a minute.
He put down the duffel bag and asked me to follow him so he could show me the problem with the pipe. He opened the basement door and started walking down, and I hesitantly followed down a few steps before I thought of something.
Hold on. I'm gonna go get my phone so I can take pictures of it. I'll be right back.
I said, hurrying back up the steps. Thankfully, he stayed. I rushed to my room and got my phone and keys, then went to the front door. But before I left, I quickly went over to the duffel bag and opened it just to make sure I wasn't wrong. Inside the bag, there were no tools, at least not normal ones. I didn't know what they were, and I didn't have time to figure it out. I heard him coming back up as I rushed out of the house and into my car, driving away. I called the police as I drove to a parking lot nearby. What happened after this still bothers me every day. My landlord was still there when they showed up. However, the duffel bag he came with was not. They never found it. Through everything, all that ended up happening was I was able to move out without having to pay the fee of breaking the lease. Him showing up randomly and being creepy, or even inviting himself in, wasn't enough to do anything. I of course took the deal though, moving out right away. But, in the back of my mind, I know he's out there, probably doing whatever he was going to do to me, to someone else, and there's nothing I can do about it. I moved out of the city in June of 2022. There weren't a lot of options for places to rent, but I was still able to get something decent. I did all of the moving myself with a U-Haul, taking up my whole weekend, but it was worth it. Being in a crowded city apartment was not enjoyable, and I just wanted to have a whole house to myself that wasn't crammed together with a bunch of other people. On the first night staying there, some strange things started happening though. I was unboxing the containers in my bedroom when I heard my phone get a notification from downstairs. I walked down and picked my phone up from the kitchen counter. A text appeared, welcoming me to the neighborhood. It was from a random number. I hadn't met any of the neighbors yet, and I had my landlord's number saved in my phone already, so this was kind of freaky. I didn't respond, and instead just continued unboxing. When I was done with my room, I went back downstairs and started on the living room. I put together the TV stand and finished connecting the couch. I wasn't trying to get everything done in one day, but I did want to get all of the essentials done so I could enjoy the house a bit more. The last thing I needed to get done for the night were the bathrooms. I picked up the box and unpacked some things in the downstairs bathroom, then went upstairs to my bathroom. While organizing my stuff, I heard my phone get another notification. I was kind of annoyed, figuring it was that same unknown neighbor of mine. I organized for another minute, then went downstairs. I walked over to the counter, and then to the couch, but my phone wasn't there. I looked around, but still couldn't find it. I swore I left it on the counter, but I was tired and thought I had to have misplaced it. I checked all of the bathrooms, but came up empty-handed. I splashed some water on my face to wake me up, then figured it would turn up soon anyway, and just continued to organize my bathroom. I had taken the whole week off of work, so I wasn't worried about staying up late or sleeping in too much. I wanted to get done as much as possible before I went back to work though, because I knew I'd be too tired to do much after that. Once I finished organizing the bathroom, I gathered up all the empty boxes upstairs and brought them down to the garage. As I came back inside, I stopped in my tracks. Across the room, I saw my phone. It was sitting right on the counter in plain sight, impossible to miss. My head was spinning. I walked over and picked it up. There was a text from 10 minutes ago. It was a picture of my couch, taken from inside the living room. The couch was fully put together, so this had to have been taken right after I went upstairs. I quickly turned around, scanning the room. I opened every closet and checked behind everything. The house was still mostly empty, so there wasn't anywhere to hide. I was freaking out, questioning everything. At one point, I even walked over and stood exactly where the picture was taken, from right in the middle of the living room. It wasn't until then that my head started working again, and I realized I needed to call the police right away. I opened up my phone, but immediately got another text. It read, "Come outside." The doorbell rang seconds later, making me completely freak out. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom and called the police. More and more texts came in, demanding me to go outside. They banged at the front door, and then it went quiet for a minute. No texts, no movement outside. Then I heard faint footsteps walking around the house. They got to the backyard and reached the patio, but then it went quiet again. It was silent all the way up until the police arrived. They searched the whole house, inside and out, but found nothing aside from a couple shoe prints. But they could have been anyone's, since the house had been viewed by a bunch of people before I moved in, and I hadn't had a chance to clean the floors yet. It really freaks me out, thinking about how I never heard them walk away. The most disturbing part, though, was that they were inside my house, taking pictures and everything, and I had no idea. I've been living in the same house for almost a year now, and haven't encountered any more situations yet. But how would I even know? They could be stalking me right now without me even knowing it. When I turned 23, I started searching around for a place to live. I was looking at renting, and with my budget, I was able to afford either a nice apartment or a small house in my area. I found a lot of great options for apartments, but a house just seemed so much more appealing to me for some reason. After a few months, I finally found a house that I was happy with. It was a small 2-story home with a fenced-in backyard, and it was within my budget. The inside was outdated, but not so much that it bothered me. On move-in day, I picked up my U-Haul early in the morning and shoved my boxes and a few pieces of furniture in it, then drove down to the house. I was moving from living with my parents, so I didn't have much to bring. I'd prepared by buying some things, like kitchen utensils, but I had almost no furniture aside from a bed. When I pulled up to my new home at 8 in the morning, the neighborhood was quiet. Nobody was out, and it just felt peaceful. I was really excited. I got out and opened the garage, then hauled the boxes back and forth from the truck to the living room. This only took me 2 hours, but I had the truck booked for a whole day just in case, so I left it outside and planned to return it the following morning. I got to work right away, putting together the furniture for my bedroom. I dragged all of the pieces of my bed frame upstairs and into the room, got it all put together, then went back downstairs to get my mattress. Pushing this huge flimsy mattress up the steps by myself was not an easy task, but just as I was getting it to the top of the steps, the sound of a door slamming shut downstairs scared the shit out of me. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I stood on the staircase holding the mattress up. After a minute, I quickly moved the mattress up the last few steps, then ran downstairs and looked around. I wasn't sure which door it was, or if it was a person that did it, or maybe a breeze in the house. I don't know. I didn't know what to think. All I knew was that I heard a door slam shut. As I walked around downstairs, there was no evidence of anything. I mean, nothing at all. After trying to figure it out for half an hour, I gave up. There was nothing out of place or anything, so I just made sure the doors were all locked, then continued with setting up my room. I got my bed together, then moved my dresser and office desk upstairs. Afterwards, I unpacked all of the other boxes. By the end of the day, I had finished everything. I was proud of myself and excited for tomorrow, where I had plans to go couch shopping. At 10 o'clock, I got in bed and stayed up on my phone for a while before falling asleep. When I woke up, my room was pitch black and I was facing the wall next to my bed. I almost immediately closed my eyes again to go back to sleep until I heard the wood floorboards creak on the other side of the room. I turned over and looked with my half-open eyes, not expecting to see anything. My eyes immediately widened. My bedroom door was open, and there was a person standing in the doorway, looking at me. They looked like they were in the middle of taking a step into the room, which made the floor creak. His eyes were the only thing in the dark that stood out. They were emotionless and cold, piercing through me. After that most horrifying second of my life, they stepped back into the hallway, grabbed the door handle, and slammed it shut. I heard their footsteps run through the hallway, down the stairs, and out of the house. I thought I was going to have a heart attack, but I forced myself up and called 911. The TLDR summary for the next few days is that the police had no idea who it was. But we talked with the homeowner I was renting from, and they said the last resident had to be evicted for not paying rent, and after a few months of no contact, all of their stuff was removed from the property. From what they were saying, the guy living there never turned up. Police confirmed this. They said there were very few records of them, and they kind of just disappeared without a trace. It's been years since then, and I obviously left that house right away, but I still wonder about it a lot. Either that person I saw was the previous tenant, or it could have been the one who made the previous tenant go missing. Either way, it was clear that they didn't want me there. Before I get into this next story, I want to talk about an important sponsor for today's video. Aura is an advanced online digital security service, allowing you to scan and remove your personal data from various online sources, including scam centers, the dark web, and data brokers. These entities profit from your private information, making it crucial to eliminate your data from their reach. And Aura makes it as simple as possible for us to do this. With their free trial, I was registered in minutes and had Aura scan and remove my data with just a few clicks. They notified me about dozens of places all across the internet where they found my personal data, like my full name, phone number, and address. And without Aura, I never would have known. Afterwards, Aura continuously monitors my data, instantly notifying me of any issues that arise and enabling swift resolution. They also include a feature to encrypt your home's Wi-Fi, ensuring the security of all your connected devices. In today's world, personal identity and data theft are unfortunately widespread, affecting a significant number of U.S. citizens, with millions falling victim each year, resulting in huge financial losses. With Aura, you can have the utmost confidence in your security and prevention measures. For a completely free 14-day trial, visit aura.com/whispered or scan the provided QR code. During this trial, you can discover if your personal data has been compromised, remove your data from multiple prominent platforms, and securely monitor your personal identity. I highly recommend using this free trial to see if your data has been stolen and to keep your identity secure. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video and keeping our personal data secure. I'm 20 years old, and last year in July, I moved into a place to live by myself for the first time. It was an apartment with 8 units in the building. This apartment was the cheapest of every available place for rent on the market at the time. I had a full-time job, but I didn't make much, and I really rushed myself to move out of my parents' house before I was actually ready. On the day I moved in, I set up a futon couch in the living space and hung up my small TV, and that was pretty much it. I didn't have anything else aside from the basics, and I didn't have the money to buy more stuff. The futon was my bed for the time being, so I slept out in the open. On that first night though, I was woken up at 6 a.m. to someone knocking at my door. I looked over at the door, not wanting to get up. But once they knocked again, I realized they weren't going to leave. There was an older man, mid-40s I'd say, standing outside my unit. He was just looking at the door, waiting for me to answer, and seeming to have no intent on leaving. I opened up and asked what he was here for.
I wanted to introduce myself. I live in the unit one door down,
he said, pointing to the door at the end of the hall. I smiled and said thanks and all that, then told him I was busy and had to get back. I closed the door and went back to my couch. I had the next 3 days off from work, and all I wanted to do was sleep in and enjoy my new apartment alone. I fell back asleep, not waking up until midday. After showering, I grabbed my keys and headed down to my car to pick up some food. As I was backing out of my parking space, I saw someone watching me from a window. They looked away once I looked at them, which made me uncomfortable. I counted the windows up to the 3rd story, which was the same floor as mine, and knowing that there were 2 units per floor, that had to be the same man who'd come by that morning. It left me with a weird feeling, but I pulled out and left to get food. When I got back to my apartment, I ate while watching TV and spent the rest of the day on the couch. I stayed up until 11 when my eyes started getting heavy. I turned off all the lights and laid down on the futon. but something caught my attention. There was this red light coming from somewhere in the kitchen. It wasn't too bright or anything, but it was blinking on and off, which became an annoyance for me. I got up and went into the kitchen, thinking it was going to be the dishwasher or microwave, but neither of them had lights. As I was looking at every appliance, the light blinked off and stayed off. I was so tired I didn't even think about it until the morning. With all the lights on now, I did another quick search, and to my surprise, I found something. There was this small thing wedged between my refrigerator and the wall. I moved the fridge and pulled it out. It was a camera, a really tiny one, but it was 100% a camera of some kind. I stood there looking at it for a couple minutes, until someone knocked on my door. I checked, and it was that same older man from the other day. I opened the door cautiously. The man said he was seeing how I was, but he sounded and looked nervous. He had a strange smile, just seemed off. He took a step closer to the door, and I said I was fine, but was busy again today. He didn't respond after that, but instead just stood there with a strange and awkward look. I felt anticipation, like he was going to do something. He quickly shoved himself toward the door, trying to get inside. Luckily I was stronger and pushed the door into him, keeping him out and eventually shutting the door all the way and locking it. I called the cops, and within 10 minutes the guy was in handcuffs. When I showed the cops the camera I found, he admitted it was him without even fighting it. But after a further investigation, they found cameras in 3 other units. I think by admitting to the one in my unit, he thought they would trust him and not feel the need to investigate the other units. I know it was just some sick creep who probably wouldn't have done me any real harm, but it gave me the weirdest, most unnerving feeling I'd ever had. I moved to Portland last fall. It was a work thing, so I was kind of forced to. The housing prices in Portland were and still are really expensive, so I had to get something away from the city. The house I settled on was on the lesser side of things. It was old and run down. If you took a quick glance, you might even think it was abandoned. For its price, though, I was able to save a decent chunk of cash. I figured I'd be able to renovate it and maybe fix it up so it wasn't so bad. The one thing I couldn't fix, though, was the neighborhood. It was full of houses just like mine and some really sketchy looking people. Guys were strolling around in ripped up white beater tank tops and had guns very noticeably wedged in their pants. While I saw the neighborhood wasn't ideal when I first came to look at the house, these kinds of people I didn't know would be here. I thought it would be normal, nice people just like me who just couldn't afford a nice place. About 2 weeks into living there, I was taking a walk around the block with my dog, and around halfway through I noticed some guys walking behind me. They were far back, but there was no doubt that they were taking the same turns as me. I glanced back a few times, seeing 3 men, none of which looked like the type to be taking a nice evening walk just for fun. I took a shortcut home to avoid any possible altercations, but just a few minutes later, my dog started barking at the front door. I peeked out the blinds and saw one of the men standing at the door. I looked around for the others, but only saw him. I put the chain latch on the door and cracked it open.
Can I help you? Yeah, I'm looking for Chris.
He said it confidently, like I knew for sure who this Chris guy was.
I don't know any Chris. I just moved here.
I saw him sneak a few looks into my house through the crack in the door. Then he said, "See you later," and left. I I knew something was up, but I didn't know what. The next few days, I noticed these same 3 men looking at my house multiple times a day. They'd always be separate and come at different times, but they would stand across the street or walk past my house and very obviously look at my place. I was nervous, but I didn't know what to say if I called the police. I didn't think the police would be of any help even if I did call. Then one night, around 9 p.m., I got a knock at my door. When I looked at who it wasn't any of the men I'd seen before. He knocked again, but I chose to ignore them and just wait for him to leave. I watched as he turned around and threw his hands up in frustration, like he was communicating to someone across the street that I wasn't answering. He turned back around and banged on the door, this time with the handle of his gun. I ran to the kitchen and got my handgun out of my hidden case. I heard a few men talking on the side of my house, followed by someone banging on my back door too. I ran to the far corner of the living room and called the police, while the men outside started yelling at each other. I heard them shuffling around, talking about where to break in. It was one of the scariest things to hear in that kind of situation. But then out of nowhere, there was a gunshot from far away, not from any of the men around my house. I heard them all yelling and scattering away. Police took forever. When they showed up, they basically just said it sounded like a gang trying to flex their territory or something. They offered me nothing helpful. I still don't even know who shot at the gang either, but they seem to be looking out for me, so I really appreciate them. Who knows what they would have done if they had broken in. I moved out of that neighborhood as soon as I could and got a small apartment closer to the city. It feels safer, but after all of that, I'm not sure if I'll ever really feel safe living here.